Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here with the first video in a new series of videos I'm going to be doing. This is a new Avatar slash Korra series I will be doing, and as you can see from the title, it's just going to basically be the weekly Avatar Korra discussion topic. So it's just going to be, I choose a kind of specific topic. I'm not going to try and go over anything too general so I can get really in depth on the topic, and I'm just going to discuss it. The length of the videos will probably be somewhere between 20, maybe 25 minutes at the most, depending on the topic. I'm just going to discuss it, going to have some like screenshots up on screen to kind of be act as the visuals of the video, and hopefully it should be pretty interesting and insightful, because this style of video is definitely going to play on what I consider to be my strength as an Avatar fan, which is my knowledge of the content, my ability to analyze that and kind of put it all together, combined with the fact that in general I'm fairly positive on nearly everything in the franchise, and so I feel it can act as a kind of learning tool for some people about whatever the topic is, and also just be an interesting video to actually listen to. So this first video, the topic I've chosen is quite simply just Unalaq, the Book 2 villain. And I'll get into, of course, why I chose this, but I just felt that this was a topic I could say a lot about. You guys know my thoughts on Book 2, and a little bit about my thoughts on Unalaq, but I haven't talked about him in depth all that much, so should be a pretty fun video overall. So just before I get started into the topic, I'll just say that this is going to be one of those series where I definitely want your guys' help. If you have a topic that you would like me to discuss in one of the videos, definitely let me know in the comments below or something like that. PM me or whatever. Ask me on Twitter, Tumblr. Just get the topic to me somehow, and I'll probably do it at some point, because I will eventually at some point run out of topics, like I kind of ran out of top 10s to do. I'm going to run out of topics here, so you guys suggesting ones to me are definitely going to help me. So let's get into the discussion topic for this first video, and that is Unalaq. So, okay, let me first explain why I've picked Unalaq as my first discussion topic. The main reason I chose Unalaq is because he's one of those characters who I find is rarely discussed online, and then when he actually is, most of the discussion is just, he's so boring, or it was so obvious that he was a villain, and so on. Just very kind of quick statements, not a lot of actual proper discussion and analysis of him as a character, and what he was actually doing during Book 2, Spirits. And I think, you know, the fact that he is from Book 2, Spirits, and he's the villain of that book, is probably one of the reasons why he's not discussed that much, because that book is widely considered to be the worst of all 4 books of Korra, and thus people tend to consider him the weakest of the villains. Any of you guys who have followed me for any decent amount of time will probably know that Book 2 Spirits is my favourite book of Korra, and that I would actually consider to be Unalaq to be one of my favourite villains. Maybe not my top villain. I'd probably say Amon is still probably the overall best villain, but he's up there, and I would consider the Red Lotus from Book 3 to be the weakest villains. But this video is not about the Red Lotus, at least not fully. They will come up later on in a really interesting fashion, but this video is going to focus completely on Unalaq. So yeah, that's what I'm going to be talking about, Unalaq. And this video is going to give me the chance to explain and analyze him as a villain, and really get my thoughts out there about why I think Unalaq is such an interesting villain. And a villain who does not really get the credit he deserves just as a character, because he's just so often dismissed as just, oh, that guy, he was boring and stuff like that. So, let's get into things. That is definitely enough of an introduction. Let's get to the discussion topics. So first up, let me straight away dispel one of the most common criticisms of him that I mentioned above. So many people say it was so obvious that he was a villain. And whenever I hear people say this, hear it or see it written online, I'm always left thinking to myself, you know, it's not like they were trying to hide it. Like, why do you feel the need to say that? Like, I don't think it was meant to be any sort of a secret or really a big reveal that he turned out to be the villain. Especially us as the audience, we knew going in he was the villain, just from following the show. and then it was really clear from some of the stuff he was doing early on that he was the villain. The thing is just that Korra only discovers it at the end of episode 2. Now, keep in mind, it's at the end of the second episode he's revealed to be the villain. He only teaches her for really just episode 2, just that one episode. It's not really that big of a deal, and so in that sense I don't get why this is a criticism so often brought up about him as a character. It's just kind of like a criticism where I just kind of go, you're really kind of missing the point here. It was never meant to be a reveal. He is the villain. He's not your typical villain, I don't think. He's kind of different than the other ones, but I'll get into that later on. So it's one of those criticisms I kind of just tend to ignore it when it comes up, because it's just like, and okay, it was kind of obvious he was the villain. Okay, they weren't trying to hide it, but let's move on. As for the second criticism I brought up there earlier on, that he's boring. Just that one word, boring, comes up so much in relation to Unalaq, and I definitely don't agree, but this is definitely a topic that's much more opinion focused rather than the previous thing which I just talked about, which is definitely kind of like, I feel you just kind of missed the point there. Like, that's not really like an opinion thing. You just kind of said, oh, I feel it was obvious. The boring thing is definitely like much more up to personal taste. I find him interesting, and this video is kind of, what I'm trying to do here is to show that he's not a boring character, that he's actually got a lot of really interesting things about him. And so, as I'll kind of mention towards the end of the video, this video isn't going to try and convince you to like Unalaq. It's just here to point out that he's not boring, that point out what is interesting about him. So just be aware of that. So, I really do think that the boring criticism comes from the fact that compared to the other villains, he's not as charismatic. He doesn't have the speaking inspirational abilities of Amon that he had with his equalist and even some of the just people of Republic City. He doesn't have the ability to kind of talk his way out of tough situations like Tarlok did. His abilities aren't as flashy as like the other Red Lotus members, and he's not as strong of a just natural leader as say Kuvira was in a kind of militaristic sense. Unalaq is just this very deeply spiritual man who will do whatever it takes to bring spirituality back to the world, regardless of if others want it or not. What interests me about him is how spiritual he is and how important he could have been had he not taken his views too far. At the end of the day, he was right. The time had come for humans and spirits to attempt to reunite, but he was warped to the point where he only cared about spirits and was willing to become a spirit and actually lose his humanity to help Vaatu. And that's definitely an interesting kind of point about him, which I'll bring up later on, just this idea of Unalaq's humanity and how it's lost over the course of the book. But the main reason I find him fascinating as a character is because he's Korra's uncle, a member of her own family. And that's what makes Book 2 Spirits very interesting to me, that it has a very unique hero-villain dynamic. They're at conflict with each other, but this is Korra fighting against her uncle. And this plays really well into the two key themes that are explored throughout Book 2. And Book 2 is definitely one of the clearest books when it comes to just really straight away highlighting what the key points of the book are. The two key themes explored in Book 2 are spirituality and family. And I'm going to refer to these two a lot over the course of this video as we go on. And so definitely remember those and just keep them in mind as we progress. So yeah, the dynamic between our hero and villain is represents these two things very well. Korra takes her first big steps with becoming more spiritual because of Unalaq's training, because of the training of her uncle. And as much as he's using her in these opening few episodes, he does honestly have to teach her the proper, correct way to be more spiritual, because she actually just struggles with that. So he can't come across as his kind of true views on spirituality and his villain ways. He actually just has to teach her naturally. And I think the way he teaches her in the first couple of episodes represents his views on spirituality before they became warped by his kind of desire to help Vaatu and stuff like that. So those first 2 episodes before he kind of reveals himself to be the kind of bad guy, I think the way he teaches Korra kind of shows who he was before, which is definitely interesting about him. But yeah, the advice and techniques that Unalaq actually teaches Korra, you know, he teaches her them in the early episodes, and they come back and are really important at the end of the book. Korra is forced to use her spiritual training from Unalaq to defeat her uncle, and she defeats him using the technique that he taught her, you know, spirit bending, and then realizes that, you know, although he took his ideals too far, way too extreme, at a base level he was right that humans and spirits did need to come back together. There did need to be an attempt to bridge the gap between those two, that the Avatar's role, you know, as the bridge between the two worlds wasn't just to keep the two separate and deal with any conflicts that come up. The Avatar's role kind of as the Avatar, as a being who is kind of half human, half spirit, you know, in one being that represents both, should kind of try to bring these two back together after they've been apart too long. I'm not saying that Avatar 1 was wrong in what he did. At the time, 1 was correct in separating humans and spirits because it needed to happen to give humans a chance to just live in their own world normally again, and give a chance for spirits to realize that their home is the spirit world, not always the kind of physical world which had kind of taken over at that point in time. But so many years on, 10,000 years on, there was definitely a need to try and fix things again. So his ideals, his kind of big thing that Korra eventually learns from, is definitely really kind of good in this book. So in that sense, Unalaq is a very important villain for Korra to have faced over the course of the show, in that it shows that while she learns to basically learn from her past enemies in book 4, that's a big point, that she doesn't think about them so much because she's actually learned from them. That's a big thing she has to learn. She's already done this in book 2, in that her decision to open the spirit portals is because she's taken what she learned from Unalaq and is using that in the kind of correct way. She's kind of applying her own spiritual ideals to his ideals and is kind of making this happen. So I really like that. Another point I'd make is just one of my favorite quotes from book 2, and that's obviously the name of one of the episodes, Light in the Dark. That quote comes from Unalaq in episode 2, and he says to her, "Korra, all the past avatars live on inside you. Let them guide you, let them help you find the light in the dark." And basically that advice, light in the dark, is the key point towards the end of the book, in that Korra has to get Rava back out of Unavatu by finding the one tiny bit of light still left in the world at that point in time. And she does it with help from Jinora, of course, but she does that. So that's really interesting kind of idea that they deal with right there. But let's move on. A kind of smaller detail, I suppose, about Unalaq that I think some people miss out on, or at the very least just isn't discussed that much, is the reason why Unalaq takes such a big interest in Korra. In that, and I'm speculating a little bit here, but I definitely think it's implied, that his dream was always to have the Avatar be his child, to be able to raise the Avatar in a way that he thought the Avatar should be raised. And this is where I'll bring in the rivalry between the two brothers. I'll bring in Unalaq's brother Tonraq, Korra's father. They are brothers, and while Unalaq is a very deeply spiritual person, Tonraq isn't. Not spiritual at all, and in fact is actually a little bit anti-spirit, as we see in some aspects of book 2. Tonraq is more of your typical kind of macho, water tribe, strong warrior, really good athlete, and very different kind of body build to Unalaq, and thus is seen as kind of the perfect guy to become the next chief. And you can really see that. You straight away see the the jealousy and the rivalry that develops between these brothers. Of course, mostly on Unalaq's side. He becomes jealous of his brother rather than kind of the other way around. And clearly Unalaq kind of has some sense of like wanting power, and he wants to be the chief. And you definitely see that in some of the flashbacks. And, you know, because, you know, spirituality at this point in time isn't that big of a thing, no one seems to care about it. It's a big thing that Unalaq as a character deals with, the fact that the world isn't very spiritual anymore. So he's kind of passed over as a potential chief because his talents lie in the spiritual side of things, whereas I suppose at that point in time their father sees an actual better warrior as the kind of better guy to be the next leader. And so what does Unalaq do in this situation? He engineers a situation where Tonraq is seen to bring disaster to the Northern Water Tribe. He hires those barbarians to attack. That leads Tonraq to step up basically as the defender of the Northern Water Tribe, and he shows his lack of spirituality and attacks the barbarians, but in doing so ends up destroying this kind of spirit forest and is seen to bring the wrath of the spirits upon the Northern Water Tribe. And this creates the perfect situation for Unalaq to be the hero. He uses his spiritual knowledge to become the hero of the day and basically send the spirits back to where they came from, and he is seen as the hero and Tonraq is seen as the villain. Tonraq gets banished. Unalaq becomes the chief, eventually the chief of both tribes, and you see this power play that he made, and he got what he wanted. And that's a really interesting idea of his character, that he's manipulative, he can plan when he needs to, and you can see just how spiritual he is at this point in time, being able to use the spirits so effectively. But let's move on to basically his jealousy growing even worse after this, when he finds out that his brother, despite being banished, started a family, and his daughter ended up being the Avatar. Not his two kids, neither of his two kids ended up being the Avatar. He just had two twins that were normal, and his non-spiritual brother was the one who kind of fathered the Avatar. And it's just this really ironic moment, and at that point in time you kind of get into Unalaq's mind, and you have to think like that must have been the most frustrating moment of his life when he first heard that his brother had the Avatar as his daughter. So it's a really kind of cool thing, and this plays into a lot of things into the future, how he cares very little for his own kids and family because he didn't get what he wanted, I suppose, out of his family, and how, you know, he then plans his schemes to kidnap Korra to again fulfill his ultimate goal, which is to have the Avatar on his side so that he can use the Avatar to open the spirit portals to free Vaatu and to bring what he sees as balance back with the spirits free to roam the world and stuff like that. But it eventually develops into spirits being dominant over humans as his kind of ideals. But yeah, let's then bring up the whole other thing that I think a lot of people miss out on, that's brought up in book 3, that Unalaq is a member of the Red Lotus, or was a member of the Red Lotus. He was one of their leaders. He was a level above Zahir, Ghazan, Pali, Ming-Hua, and he actually was the one who ordered them to do that raid to kidnap Korra that was so impactful in Korra's life. So yeah, he was the one who came up with that plan, and that's really interesting just looking at it, that he's a villain who was in book 2, but they made him really important just in terms of past events by bringing him up in such a big way in book 3. And so, you know, you get this from Zahir, that the idea was always that they would capture Korra at a very young age and raise her with the ideals of the Red Lotus rather than the White Lotus, with basically, Pili as her firebending teacher, Ming-Hua as her waterbending teacher, Ghazan as her earthbending teacher, and I suppose Zahir, back then he didn't have airbending, but he still would know enough, I suppose, to potentially train her as her airbending teacher. And she would have been this kind of kind of dark avatar in a way, even though she was the actual avatar, but her ideals would have been that of this kind of rebellious faction rather than the kind of White Lotus. So straight away, that's a really interesting concept that's brought up. But that his plan was always somehow to use the avatar to open the portals, basically. And yeah, originally it was by having the avatar be his child, then be his pupil, but when that didn't work out, he somehow had to get Korra on his side, which is where he uses the fact that the kidnapping attempt failed. He didn't help his allies, and instead assisted Zuko in building this prison in the Northern Water Tribe to nullify Poli's abilities. And as we see, he went against the Red Lotus's actual plan to free Vaatu, and in fact merged with Vaatu and became the Avatar himself. If he couldn't get the actual Avatar to do what he needed to do, he was going to become that person himself and do it himself. So you see a lot of really interesting things coming out about kind of what he's doing. So just really, really interesting. And of course, this failed kidnapping attempt leads to Korra being confined in the Southern Water Tribe training compound for basically her entire childhood. And this creates the issue that causes the rift between Korra and her father, creates the rift between Korra and Tenzin, and Unalaq then uses this failure to get Korra on his side in the early parts of Book 2 by being the one person to kind of support her when everything is going so crazy at the start of that book. And but again, you can see just by what I've said already, there's so much to him with how they've kind of interlinked the past into his story, the use of the fact that he's a member of Korra's family, and all of these little connections. It all is coming together, but I still have a little bit more to go. So, in Book 2, he's also the one character to not really care about the concept of family. Korra and her parents, Tenzin and his siblings, Tenzin and his own kids, even Mako and Bolin to some extent. All of these relationships, these family relationships, are explored well, with the characters realizing over time the importance of family. But Unalaq in this book is willing to kill his brother. He's willing to kill his niece, willing to risk the lives of kids, he nearly basically erases Jinora from existence. He's willing to sacrifice all of his humanity, and basically all of humanity, all for Vaatu and his own view on what he thinks the world should be like in relation to spirits. He doesn't care at all about his family. And even in that really, really nice moment where Tonraq and kind of Unalaq are fighting, Tonraq is willing to try again. He shouldn't want to in any way attempt to start things up again with his brother, be in any way willing to forgive him or give him another chance, but he does, because as much as Tonraq isn't spiritual, he is a family man, and he can see that that's the kind of problem here. But in many ways, Unalaq's biggest loss of humanity is the fact that he loses his kind of caring about the importance of family. And that's a really big thing that, Tonraq even learns how important it is to be spiritual, but Unalaq couldn't realize how important family is in the end. And it's so impactful to me, looking back on Korra as a series, to realize that the only villain that Korra was forced to kill throughout the entire show was Unalaq, was her uncle, a member of her own family. And she does it in such a meaningful way, with using his own technique, cleansing his tainted spirit while defeating Vaatu in the process. She says the line, "Go in peace," when she does it. So there's no anger there. She realized that what she's doing is kind of saving him in a way. She's saving him from being just this person who's controlled and his body has been taken over completely by Vaatu, and is saving him from his complete loss of humanity, even if it's killing him in the process. Because at that moment when Unavaatu was formed, that's Vaatu taking over Unalaq's body completely. There's no sense of what the actual avatar is, where it's the spirit and human together and they're kind of agreeing on the way it is to be. That is just Vaatu taken over. And you can really see this when you look at it from Eska and Desna's reaction to seeing Unavatu for the first time. In their opinion, that moment is, they're not seeing their father there at all. That is, their father has become just a part of Vatu, become a part of that monster. And Korra doing what she did, in a way, saved Unalaq in the end. So, for me, the only thing missing from Unalaq's story in terms of a big moment is just that moment where he first met or first became aware of Vatu and decided that he would devote himself to freeing him. I would really like to see some sort of a flashback about that. But as we know, Unalaq is one of, if not the most spiritual people in the Avatar universe. He must have researched well and found out about Vatu, and found out that the Avatar is the only one who can open the spirit portals. He knew Wan Shi Tong, we see that. He could have basically easily read the same book that Jinora read to find out all of this information. So even that kind of isn't completely just left out. There's something there about that. So, in conclusion, this video is not an attempt by me to convince you that Unalaq is an amazing character or is awesome or anything like that. Really, what this video is about is to just show you that Unalaq as a character, as a villain, is more than just a few dismissive comments that people make about him online. He's a villain who fits perfectly into the book that he's the villain of. A very spiritual person in a book where Korra needs to learn to be more spiritual. A wise but misguided teacher for Korra, but an important teacher for Korra nonetheless because of what she learns from him. A man who lost his humanity in a book where so many characters realize the importance of a key aspect of humanity, that being family. So, I hope this exploration of Unalaq as a character was interesting and possibly even eye-opening for you. I know that I had a really good time just kind of talking about him in such depth. He's definitely a character that I find really interesting and fascinating just because of how spiritual he is, how involved he is in one of my favourite books. I don't think he's perfect as a character, but I like how many interesting aspects there is to him. So, in conclusion, final thing I'm going to say is just definitely in the comments let me know your thoughts on the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.